Hello, and welcome to Philosophy at the Park. No, I'm just playing. This is the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. We are at the park, though. Fortunately, I live in an area where there's parks everywhere with a lot of nature, and it's very nice. But the parks, they are very close to the city, and that's a good thing. One of the funny things about that is you got a lot of people walking around, and occasionally, or often, a random person will walk up and look at me. Kind of funny because I'm talking to a camera, like that guy over there. Hello, how's it going? Anyway, we're going to be talking about Søren Kierkegaard's The Sickness Unto Death. Now, the sickness unto death is about despair, anguish. The buzzword or the word mainstream that we use today is depression, right? Depression, it is a very serious thing. A lot of people suffer from depression. A lot of people suffer from clinical depression. I know a lot of, not a lot, a good amount of people actually that suffer from clinical depression, unfortunately, wherein they have to take medication to keep it under control. Right, we know it now as like as a chemical imbalance in the mind, right, or some sort of. It's considered an illness now. Back when this book was written, The Sickness Unto Death, that wasn't the case. You know, a lot of people assumed it was more of just an emotion that you can get over. But that's, it's not as easy as that, as we know now. Even now, you watch the news and you see the celebrities falling victim to this. Severe depression. I mean, most recently, Robin Williams passed away due to his struggle with depression, right? Or despair. I don't really know what he was going through, but that's the story, right? So it's a big thing, depression. So this book is a very relevant book to today's world, because a lot of people still go through depression. And even if you don't go through like clinical form of depression, like myself, fortunately, I'm very blessed. I never had to deal with that. Everybody gets depressed at some point in their life. I mean, that's just a common thing, right? I mean, it's part of human nature. And I'm not talking about sadness. I'm talking about really deep, like despair, anguish. We all been through that. Things happen in our lives. We're not always happy all the time. And Søren Kierkegaard, he talks about that. He's talking about the human experience, and part of the human experience is despair or depression. So let's get right into it. Let's jump into some quotes. Listen to this quote. This is a very interesting quote that Kierkegaard starts off with. Every actual moment of despair is to be referred back to its possibility. Every moment he despairs, he brings it upon himself. The time is constantly the present. Nothing actual, past, and done with comes about. At every moment of actual despair, the despair bears with him all that has gone before, as something present in the form of possibility. This is because despair is an aspect of spirit. It has to do with the eternal and a person. But the eternal is something he cannot be rid of, not in all eternity. He cannot rid himself of it once and for all. Nothing is more impossible. Every moment he doesn't have it, he must have cast or be casting it off. But it returns. That is, every moment he despairs, he brings the despair upon himself. For despair is not a result of the imbalance, but of the relation with which relates to itself. And the relation to himself is something a human being cannot be rid of, just as little as he can be rid of himself, which, for that matter, is one of the same thing, since the self is indeed the relation to oneself. So what's Kierkegaard talking about here? Well, this is what I got from that quote. And I could totally be going off left field here, and if I am, just comment, let me know. Maybe you got something from that quote. But what I got from that quote was pretty much despair comes from, if we just kind of stray away from the clinical, medical, physical aspect of, serious depression, like medical depression. If we just kind of focus on just depression, just in general, it comes from the ego, I think. What he's saying is that he's saying that despair comes from when you compare yourself to yourself. I'm thinking what he's saying is that despair is when you compare your ego, your image of who you want to be, how you want to project yourself, with who you actually are. Because we all know the ego is very different from who we actually are. The ego is just this representation of who we want people to think we are, right? And we're comparing that with this ego to who we really are, and they don't match up, right? And that's discouraging. Maybe you're trying to be like really tough, strong person, but you're not so tough really in reality. And so that truth that inside, it causes you depression. Same thing if you want to be somebody and you kind of pretend, fake it until you make it, right? That whole struggle of doing that causes depression. I think that's kind of the root of it in my mind. That's what I think. And that's what I think Søren Kierkegaard is talking about. Let's move on to the next quote. I find this quote interesting. The common view of despair, however, goes no further than the appearances, and that is therefore a superficial view. That is no view. It assumes that every man knows best himself whether or not he is in despair, so that whoever says he is in despair is assumed to be so, but also whoever thinks he is not is assumed not to be. As a result, despair becomes a rather rare phenomenon, instead of being quite common. What is rare is not that someone should be in despair. No, what is rare, the great rarity, is that one should truly not be in despair. What Kierkegaard is saying here is that everybody goes through depression, right? And whether it be like a clinical, medical depression or just, depression just as an emotion, we all go through it. It's a human experience. We need to go through it. In fact, going through it is kind of an indication of our spiritual selves, really, because the ego, he's talking about how it's this common view of depression has to deal with the superficial, the appearances, right? And that's the ego, I think, right? The ego is just how we want to be seen in the physical world, but it has little to do, if any, with the spiritual self. And so it's this constant struggle. You're fighting with your spiritual self, forming this ego, projecting it onto people, and it's not reflecting who you are, really, your spiritual self. And that depression comes from that. And it's good to deal with that struggle. As human beings, we all have to go through that to discover our spirituality. Like, we do need to go through that process of dealing with the world, struggling with this idea of forming a projection, an ego, a representation of somebody who we think will be acceptable in the world, but who's not what we really are. We have to all go through that, I think, and in that way we discover our spirituality. So in a sense, despair is a necessary process, and in fact is a developing process. It makes you into a better person spiritually if you go through that form of depression and then you kind of overcome it in a way, or deal with it. Now let's get even deeper in this train of thought. Listen to this quote. The opposite of sin is faith, which is why in Romans chapter 14, verse 23, it says, whatsoever is not of faith is sin. And this is one of the most crucial definitions for the whole of Christianity, that the opposite of sin is not virtue, but faith. So Kierkegaard, he's a Christian, and he always brings it back home with some Christian ideologies. And that's cool, I'm a Christian. But let's just stay in general with the spirituality aspect of it. If you just want to keep it, if you want to generalize it that way, that's cool too. Let's keep it with this idea of ego versus the true self, the spiritual self. So we know deep down inside we're imperfect creatures. Like we have flaws. We're not perfect, There's things we could work on, things that we need to develop. But we develop these egos to try and make ourselves or project onto the world, the material world, the most perfect person that we can be. But that's a false projection, right? That's not who we really are. However, this material world, this egotistical world, forces us to do that, to succeed in the egotistical way, in this material way. So what happens when we accept our true selves, our spiritual selves, and start living as our true selves, a lot of that goes directly against how we should live in this material, egotistical world. And that can create some contradictions and paradoxes. And Kierkegaard is all about that. He talks about that a lot, about how once you start getting to the spiritual, you're forced to come to terms with contradictions and paradoxes that don't make sense in this world, this physical world. And it's the same here. When you're dealing with despair and you're trying to reconcile the ego with the spiritual, the true self, you start coming with some contradictions. So the answer to that is faith. We have to believe that our true selves, our spiritual selves, that's our best selves. That's the self with the most meaning. That's the self where we can live the greatest life. And despite this physical world telling us, no, that's not the case, it is the case. And that contradiction is the way we fight it is with faith. Let's keep going with that idea. Truly, if there is anything one should lose one's mind over, this is it. Every person who does not have the humble courage to dare to believe it is offended. But why is he offended? Because it is too exalted for him, because he cannot make sense of it, because he cannot be open and frank in the face of it, and therefore must have it removed, made it into nothing, into madness and nonsense. For it is as if it were about to choke him. For what is offense? Offense is unhappy admiration. It is therefore related to envy, but is an envy turned towards oneself. In an even stricter sense, worse when it is turned towards oneself. The natural man's narrow-mindedness cannot bring itself to accept the extraordinary that God has intended for him. And so the natural man is offended. Let me skip down a few lines. To defend something is always to discredit it. Let me skip down a little more. Yes, the person who defends that has never believed in it. If he does believe, then the enthusiasm of faith is not a defense. No, it is the assault and the victory. A believer is a victor. What I'm getting from that is oftentimes, when we deal with the spiritual self, we want to defend it. Like we want to put up a defense because it doesn't make sense. In this material world, this egotistical world, when we talk about spirituality and when we deal with really tough things and we talk about how to overcome those things, well, you start going toward the spiritual and it doesn't really make sense in a material way. And we're compelled sometimes, or people force us to defend those points of view or the way of solving these issues through spirituality. But Kierkegaard is saying there's no point to defend it because it doesn't make sense and you can't explain it. And the thing is, when you start bringing up spirituality or you start approaching hardships or problems that cause despair in a spiritual way, people will be offended by that because it doesn't make sense materially. And that offends people. And you might naturally, even yourself might get offended because it's your ego that gets offended because it doesn't match up to how society or the material world wants you to succeed. And you yourself might get offended. But you just, you get offended and you realize well, this doesn't really make any sense, but that's fine because we're talking about spiritual here and that's where faith comes in. And when you truly be faithful in your true self, your spiritual self, then you can become victorious over your despair. Let me end with this quote. This is actually a footnote that Kierkegaard did. Listen to this. This is prayer that Kierkegaard wrote. God in heaven, I thank you for not requiring a person to comprehend Christianity. For if it were required, then I would be of all men the most miserable. The more I seek to comprehend it, the more I discover merely the possibility of offense. Therefore, I thank you for requiring only faith, and I pray you will continue to increase it. It's interesting how Kierkegaard, he doesn't try to explain the metaphysical or the spiritual. He doesn't try and philosophize about that because he knows that it's beyond comprehension. We talked about this with Fear and Trembling, the video I did with that. He's a really big proponent on faith. And I would say what I get from this book is that, everybody deals with depression in some way, and it's a human part of life. So don't feel like you're broken or like you need to, or is there something necessarily wrong with you just because you're dealing with depression. Know that that's a good fight. Depression is your ego fighting with your true self, your material self, and it just is an indication that you are a human being, and that you're, even further, I would say you're a spiritual being. Depression is, in a way, it's a positive indicator of that. But we don't want to wallow in our depression, right? We don't want our depression to overcome us. That's where faith comes in. That's how you overcome despair, depression. You do it spiritually. There's all types of bad things that happen in life that we can't really control. And, so we try, and sometimes it's still not good enough. And that's just the kind of harsh reality of the world. That's where faith comes in. We have to kind of just believe in our true selves. Believe that our egos are not really who we really are, and despite the fact that who you really are doesn't really match up to what society says you should be, that's okay, because that's all based off of falsehood. There's no truth behind the ego or what you're expected to be in terms of this material world. It's all about who you really are, and to really understand that, you have to start to delve deep within yourself. You have to start to understand who you are spiritually, and despair is part of that process of doing that. So despair is a necessary thing that we have to go through, but we can overcome it, and we do it through faith. That's what I'm getting. That's the vibe I'm getting from The Sickness Unto Death by Søren Kierkegaard. I could be way off. If you feel differently, that's fine. That's what the comments are for. But that's what I got. Again, this book is very relevant to today. It deals with depression, basically, and the human experience with depression. The human experience, existentialism. Søren Kierkegaard, he knows what's up. Well, thanks for watching. This is The Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. I'll see you next time with more philosophical thought.